Check out this hole. It actually used to be a lot bigger. In fact, it was the location for one of the largest man-made explosions that ever existed. It was made by the Union Army during the Civil War by packing a tunnel with 8,000 pounds of black powder. This tunnel was directly underneath the Confederate lines, and it began what was aptly named the Battle of the Crater. Now, with a surprise like that, it's easy to think that the Union soldiers flooding through the gap in a 1-2 punch of surprise would overwhelm those poor rebels in minutes. But what if I told you that the Union lost this fight, and it wasn't even close? They got decimated. I'm talking 45% casualty rate for the 8,500 men who stormed the gap in what would become a turkey shoot, described by Ulysses S. Grant as the saddest affair he had witnessed in the war. On June 9th, 1864, the siege of Petersburg began as Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant attempted to capture the vital railroad hub of Petersburg, Virginia, and cut off the Confederate capital of Richmond. Petersburg was a crucial strategic point as it served as a major supply center for the Confederate capital of Richmond. The city was connected to Richmond by 5 railroads and various roads, making it essential for the Confederates to hold the city to maintain their supply lines. General Grant, after a series of failures during the Overland Campaign, sought to capture Petersburg and force the Confederates to defend Richmond at close range. This would prevent them from sending reinforcements elsewhere and should ultimately lead to the fall of the Confederate capital. Between June 15th and June 18th of 1864, the Union forces make several assaults on Confederate defensive positions around Petersburg, but the Confederates, under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard, successfully repel the Union assaults with heavy casualties. This marks the beginning of a prolonged siege, though not so much a siege as one of the first instances in battle of trench warfare. 20 miles of trenches were dug on either side all around Petersburg by both the Confederate and the Union forces. They dug these, and then they waited. Enter Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants and his merry band of miners, the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry, made up of hundreds of coal miners turned soldiers. Over dinner one night, one of the men was feeling nostalgic, no doubt yearning for the mines, and looking out into no man's land with a sense of déformation professionnelle, or, as the French would say, looking at things from the point of view of one's profession. This young tunneler had an idea. What about a tunnel? When you've got a hammer, suddenly everything looks like a nail. Lieutenant Colonel Pleasants, a mining engineer by trade, found a tunnel to be a fantastic idea. Go figure. He pushed the idea up to his general, Ambrose Burnside. Check this guy out, namesake for sideburns. Seriously, that's where the term comes from. Burnside saw it as an opportunity to take Petersburg in one fell swoop and sent the idea up to General Meade, commander of the Union Army and the siege, who responded apathetically, seeing it as more of a way to keep his soldiers occupied than as a tactical instrument. But that was enough for Lieutenant Colonel Pleasants and his scrappy group of miners. Well beyond the Union main line and exposing himself to sniper fire, Pleasants surveyed the line that would be used. Despite getting as close as possible without being seen or arousing any suspicion, his conclusion was that a tunnel of 510 feet would be needed. Fellow engineers assumed this would be the end of the experiment. Everybody knows you can't ventilate a tunnel more than 400 feet, they scoffed. Everybody knows that. And it's true, Henry Pleasant thought. You can't ventilate a tunnel that long, unless you're an engineering badass with a war to win. For you see, Mr. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasant knew something special, that hot air rises. So he dug a chimney down into the tunnel from above, lit a fire, and sealed off the entrance. Now that sounds like a great way to asphyxiate, unless you have a pipe of cool, fresh air snaking its way to the end of the tunnel. The fire and hot air would be expelled through the chimney, creating a vacuum that would suck fresh air out of the end of the pipe over 400 feet underground. Ingenious and clever engineering. With almost no help from Army engineers, they began to do what they've done for years. They dug. Using salvaged materials, stooped down in a 4-foot-high tunnel, working by candlelight, they toiled night and day through the hottest and driest part of the Virginia summer. In just over a month, the tunnel would be completed. 23 feet a day exhumed. Confederate suspicions had been aroused of the activity, as every time someone went out in that general sector, they would be harassed with sniper fire, uncommonly aggressive sniper fire. A tunnel was correctly assumed, and the Confederates began their own tunnel in an attempt to cut it off. But it was too little too late to stop what was coming. The tunnel was completed on July 23rd, and over the next week, the men of the 48th Pennsylvania would stoop down, load 50 pounds of black powder into a custom-built yoke, and hand carry a total of 8,000 pounds of explosives through the narrow 500-foot tunnel. At the end was a cavity with troughs that they would dump it into, under very carefully protected candlelight, no doubt. After it was fully loaded, the remaining earth was shaped to project the explosion upwards, and a series of daisy-chained fuses were connected. Not good mining fuses, though, as they'd requested. The Army engineers provided artillery fuses, which were much cheaper and prone to failure. A little foreshadowing for you. The plan was to go into motion at 3:30 on the morning of July 30th, 1864. Nothing like the hottest day of the year to open up a portal to hell underneath those damn rebels, right? The men were staged. The fuse is set, literally. The thousands of Union soldiers and officers wait. And they wait. And then they wait some more. They wait too long, longer than the fuse was supposed to last by quite a bit. Dawn was approaching, and someone had to go figure out what had happened. So the two bravest men Pennsylvania had to offer, Lieutenant Jacob Doughty and Sergeant Harry Reese, crawled into the ticking time bomb and found the substandard fuses had stopped short at one of the splices necessary to carry it the entire length. They relit it, and I'm sure ran like hell. In the diminishing pre-dawn darkness at 4:44 a.m., the explosions were detonated, creating a massive crater 170 feet long, 60 to 80 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. The blast kills 278 Confederate soldiers instantly. The men on both sides are now witness to one of the largest man-made explosions ever created. The explosion is heard for miles around and creates a scene of devastation. Debris, including soldiers' bodies, is thrown high into the air. The blast also destroys several Confederate cannons and creates a large gap in their defensive line. The path to Petersburg is now open, and 80 miles beyond the Confederate capital of Richmond. However, the explosion also creates a large amount of smoke and dust, which obscures the battlefield and makes it difficult for Union troops to see and navigate. Confusion reigns on both sides. This is the beginning of what would become one of the most chaotic engagements of the war. The first wave of Union soldiers charge forward, and they run right up to the lip of the crater. Most stop dead in their tracks and just stare at the scene of destruction. Others begin digging out the Confederate men trapped under the dirt and clay, suffocating. Some even begin souvenir hunting. Thousands of Yankee soldiers go straight down into the crater and are met with a 30-foot wall of dirt on the other side. They crush into one another, preventing any movement as it's nearly impossible to climb up the Confederate lines. Those who manage to climb forward are singled out and shot by the rebels, tumbling back into their own men. General Meade demands General Burnside send more men into the breach, and 2 more divisions begin pressing the initial wave forward. The last wave of troops sent forward are a division of black soldiers, part of the United States Colored Troop Divisions. These men were supposed to be the first forward, but General Meade thought it would appear that leadership was sending them on essentially a suicide mission, and told Burnside to pick a white division to lead the charge. This decision was the real fuel to what would become the disaster that was the battle. Here, on the hilltop headquarters overlooking the entire battlefield, General Ambrose Burnside had to make a decision. Which division was he going to send in the place of the colored troops who had already trained for this attack? And by saying that he needed to make a decision, that's kind of a misnomer, because General Burnside left it up to chance, and chance screwed him over. And that's because after drawing straws, Brigadier General James Ledlie was the man who was chosen to make the initial attack with his division. The Black Division had trained for weeks for the anticipated fight and were passionate about leading the charge and proud to take the helm. They drilled through the series of battle as you do, preparing for what you would encounter. The plan was to wait for the explosion and then swarm around it, splitting the division to the left and to the right of the whole, and using the remaining high ground to smash through the Confederate lines unaffected by the blast, but still reeling from the explosion. Ledlie barely briefed his men, gave them no tactical direction, and didn't oversee or even accompany his men during the attack. Those men, having not trained at all like the Black Division, treated the crater as a rifle pit from which to shoot out of, only to realize too late that it in fact was just a pit and was quickly filling, with Union soldiers pressing forward. This mass confusion and panic allowed the Confederates to mount a counterattack. Those not completely shocked by the explosion began shooting at the mass of blue down in the crater. It was, as described by one soldier, a turkey shoot. With nowhere to go or hide, fighting uphill in a thronging mass, they were helpless. Men were being shot and killed, but didn't even have enough room to fall to the ground, suspended by those around them. It was here in these ditches that the Black troops waited to be the last ones in, despite the fact that they had trained to be the first ones through the breach. They waited in what is called a covered way, protecting them from any fire, and all they could do was sit and listen to what was going on only a few hundred yards away, and it didn't sound very good. The United States colored troops arrived, and by then the plan to go around the crater was sealed off by mounting defense. They were forced into the same fray, unable to exploit the crater. None of the Union leadership accompanied the four divisions, 8,500 men, into the fight. With no guidance, the Union soldiers were directionless and now fighting for their lives. While the initial defense gained traction, a more formal response was being summoned in the trenches several hundred yards in the Confederate rear. Confederate General William Mahone was essentially the opposite of the Union's Brigadier General James Ledlie. While Ledlie not only did not accompany his division into battle, he was found in the rear of the Union lines, completely drunk in a bunker, while his men were being slaughtered. Mahone, a Virginia native standing a perfectly acceptable 5'6" and weighing all of 100 pounds, was gathering rebel soldiers and led them to the forward lines and the crater to bolster the defense. Injured and retreating Confederate soldiers would pass by Mahone and his men, remarking that there was hot work up ahead and that a division of Black Union soldiers was attempting to breach their line. This further incited the Confederate men as the demand for no quarter, no remorse was elicited up and down the lines. They rushed forward to the fight. Upon arrival, they pour heavy fire into the crater, inflicting severe casualties on the Union troops. General Mahone, known for his tactical skills, sends in troops from all sides of the crater, effectively trapping the Union soldiers inside. The Confederates also bring up artillery and begin firing into the crater, causing horrific casualties among the densely packed Union troops. The United States colored troops faced particularly heavy fire and suffered disproportionate losses. Barely any are allowed to surrender, bayoneted or shot instead. What could have been the open door that led the Union Army to Richmond and essentially the end of the Civil War was slammed shut by a lack of leadership and tactical sense. The Union losses include 504 killed, 1,881 wounded, and 1,413 missing or captured, approximately 3,800 casualties to the Confederates' 1,500. Many of the captured Union soldiers, particularly the U.S. colored troops, are subjected to brutal treatment by the Confederates, including summary executions. The Confederate losses, while lower, were still significant, with around 200 killed, 900 wounded, and 400 missing or captured, not including those killed in the blast. But the most notable metric was that the victory at the crater provided a much-needed boost to Confederate morale and to the besieged rebels defending Petersburg. The devastating losses at the crater and throughout the Overland campaign led to a severe decrease in morale for Union troops. Many soldiers and civilians began to question the leadership of General Grant and the overall strategy of the war. The Confederates, bolstered by their victory at the crater, continued to hold their defensive positions around Petersburg. The siege settled into a stalemate, with both sides engaged in trench warfare and periodic skirmishes. The stalemate would continue for another 8 months until the Union finally broke through in April of 1865. After months of trench warfare and several failed attempts to break the lines, the Union forces under General Grant launch a massive assault on April 2, 1865. This attack, known as the Third Battle of Petersburg, or the Breakthrough at Petersburg, involves over 60,000 Union troops. The Union assault overwhelms the depleted and exhausted Confederate forces who have been stretched thin by months of continuous fighting. The Confederates are forced to abandon their defensive positions and retreat westward, leaving Petersburg and Richmond to the Union. After a week of retreat and pursuit, General Lee finds his army surrounded and outnumbered by Union forces at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Realizing that further resistance is futile, Lee agrees to meet with General Grant to discuss terms of surrender and effectively end the Civil War, as other Confederate armies follow suit and surrender in the following weeks. The war officially ends on May 9, 1865, with the capture of the last Confederate forces in Texas. The siege of Petersburg, lasting nearly 10 months, was one of the longest and most extensive sieges of the Civil War. General Mahone would become a legend in the South, while Union General Ledlie would be kicked out of the Army by General Grant. You've got to be a real drunk to get kicked out by a guy who was literally known for being a functioning alcoholic. I guess the key word there is functioning. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasant, leader of the 48th Infantry in the tunneling excavations, would be praised for the ingenuity and hard work by him and his men. Throughout the course of the war, he would get promoted 6 times, from second lieutenant to brigadier general. He would then go back to Pennsylvania, where he would become a mining engineer. Damn good one, I bet. If you like that, check out this video about another damned Yankee, William Tecumseh Sherman, who left a path of destruction across the Confederacy and was hated by those in the South, and still is by some today. Or check out this video about the Confederate submarine that killed more of its own sailors than enemy. Thanks for watching till the end. Till next time, get lost.